All right, getting right into it today. We are diving deep into a period of history that never ceases to amaze me, the space race. And to help us navigate this fascinating era, we have, as always, some incredible source material. This time around, we've got excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the space race. Should be a great jumping off point for our conversation.
It really is. It gives a solid overview of all the key events and players. And I think it also hints at some of the deeper themes we can explore today.
Exactly. We're not just going to be listing off a timeline of rockets and launches. I want to understand the motivations, the strategies, the personalities even behind this epic rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union.
It was about so much more than just getting to space first.
Yeah.
It was about ambition, it was about technological innovation, and, of course, ideological struggle. And all of this was playing out against the backdrop of the Cold War, a time of incredible tension and the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, the Cold War. It's impossible to talk about the space race without that context, isn't it?
Absolutely. It was a time of deep mistrust between the U.S. and the USSR. Each side was determined to prove its dominance on the world stage. And that competition extended beyond just politics and economics. It permeated every aspect of life, including science and technology.
It's kind of wild to think that something as awe-inspiring as space exploration could emerge from such a tense period in history.
Yeah, but it did. Both sides saw space as the ultimate proving ground, if you could launch a satellite.
Hmm.
Or even better, a human being into orbit. Well, that was a powerful symbol of technological and ideological superiority.
So it was like this high-stakes game of one-upmanship.
Precisely. And that's where ICBMs come in, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Originally designed to deliver nuclear weapons, these powerful rockets actually ended up forming the foundation for both the American and Soviet space programs.
It's a kind of a stark reminder of how intertwined science and warfare can be.
Yeah, it really highlights that duality, doesn't it? Technology that was initially meant for destruction ends up fueling our exploration beyond Earth.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Sputnik, the event that really kicked off the space race. I know this has been talked about extensively, but I'm still blown away by the impact it had.
Sputnik 1, launched by the Soviets in 1957, really was a watershed moment. I mean, here was this small, beeping satellite orbiting the Earth, broadcasting a signal that anyone with a radio could pick up. It captured the imagination of the entire world. And it also triggered a wave of anxiety, especially in the United States.
It's kind of funny to think about it now. This relatively simple satellite, by today's standards, caused such a frenzy.
Well, it's important to remember that at that time, people were still getting used to the idea of airplanes, the concept of a human-made object orbiting the Earth. It was mind-boggling for most people. And for the United States, a nation that prided itself on technological superiority, is a major wake-up call. And really, that was the beginning of what became known as the Sputnik crisis.
It's like the classic underdog story. The Soviets, who many in the West had underestimated, suddenly appeared to be, well, light years ahead.
And it wasn't just about the Soviets being technologically ahead. The size of Sputnik 2, which carried a dog named Laika, led the U.S. to believe that the Soviet rockets were much more powerful than their own. It turned out to be a miscalculation, of course, but it fueled a real sense of urgency for the U.S. to catch up.
So how did President Eisenhower react to this? Was he immediately on board with this idea of a space race?
Not exactly. Eisenhower was actually hesitant about using military rockets for space exploration. He was concerned about militarizing space.
Yeah.
And potentially escalating tensions with the Soviets even further.
Interesting. So his concerns weren't initially driven by competition.
No, his focus was more on national security, global stability. He actually preferred a more measured approach and opted to develop a civilian space program using the Vanguard rocket rather than Wernher von Braun's more powerful Jupiter C missile.
Ah, von Braun, the legendary rocket scientist who, later became instrumental to the U.S. space program.
Yeah, he was a key figure in developing the Saturn V rocket, the rocket that ultimately took us to the moon. But at this early stage, Eisenhower was a bit reluctant to fully utilize von Braun's expertise. He felt it was really important to maintain that distinction between military and civilian space programs.
But that decision to go with the Vanguard didn't really go as planned, did it?
It's one of those historical what-ifs, isn't it? A series of very public failures with the Vanguard program. All while the Soviets were racking up successes, it really forced the U.S. to reassess its approach.
I bet those public failures were particularly difficult to swallow, given the scrutiny of the media and the anxieties of the Cold War.
It was a blow to American pride, for sure. But as we often see in history, setbacks can sometimes be catalysts for change. The failures of the Vanguard program actually paved the way for the creation of NASA and a renewed focus on space exploration, with, of course, a much bigger budget.
So while the U.S. was scrambling to reorganize, the Soviets were not exactly sitting idly by.
Not at all. They were on a roll. In 1961, just 4 years after Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth aboard Vostok 1, another major win for the Soviets, and quite a symbolic blow to the United States.
Yeah, I can only imagine the pressure that put on the U.S. to catch up, although it seems like they were always playing catch up at this point.
It was a tough position to be in, but it also fueled this incredible surge of innovation and determination in the U.S.
And this is where President Kennedy enters the picture, right? With his famous speech about putting a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
Exactly. Kennedy realized that the U.S. needed to set a bold, ambitious goal. It wasn't enough to just catch up to the Soviets anymore. He wanted to surpass them in a way that was undeniable, in a way that captured the world's imagination.
It was a pretty audacious goal considering where they were at the time.
It was a gamble, for sure, but also a brilliant strategic move. By setting such a lofty goal, Kennedy not only galvanized the American public, but he also forced the Soviets to respond. The race to the moon was officially on.
So Kennedy basically throws down this challenge, and both superpowers suddenly become laser-focused on the moon. How did that shift in focus change the way both sides approach space exploration?
Oh, it totally changed the game. Before Kennedy's speech, it was all about achieving those initial firsts, like the first satellite, first man in space. But now it became about this long-term goal, a much more complex mission, developing the technology and the resources to actually land on the moon.
Yeah, I imagine it must have been an incredibly intense time for the engineers and scientists behind the scenes, and especially for the astronauts, risking their lives to make those missions happen.
It absolutely was. And it led to some truly groundbreaking engineering feats. On the U.S. side, you had the development of the Saturn V rocket, this colossal machine capable of launching humans and payloads all the way to the moon. It's still the most powerful rocket ever built to this day.
You know, I've seen footage of those Saturn V launches, and they're just mind-blowing. You really get a sense of the sheer power and scale of these rockets.
Yeah, a true marvel of engineering. But what's interesting is that the Soviets took a different route with their N-1 rocket. Instead of going with one massive engine, they opted for a cluster of smaller engines. On paper, it seemed like a clever solution, but in reality, it turned out to be their downfall.
You mentioned earlier that the Soviets had a string of successes early on. Why do you think they struggled so much with the N-1 rocket?
It was plagued with technical issues right from the start, incredibly complex, difficult to control. And, well, let's just say, there were some interesting political dynamics involved as well, according to your source material. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, initially favored a different lunar program, one led by someone who happened to employ his son.
Wow, talk about a conflict of interest. So even in the midst of this technological race, personal connections and power plays were still a factor.
It shows you that even in something like space exploration, human ambition and political maneuvering, well, they never really disappear.
In the end, it was the failure of the N-1 that prevented the Soviets from getting to the moon first.
That's correct. They never even achieved a successful uncrewed test flight, let alone a crewed mission. It really is one of the biggest what-ifs of the space race. What if the N-1 had worked? Would we have seen a Soviet flag on the moon instead of an American one?
Fascinating to think about. Really makes you appreciate how crucial that one technological hurdle turned out to be.
And it brings up another interesting what-if from your research. Kennedy's proposal for a joint U.S.-Soviet mission to the moon.
Wait a minute, he suggested they go to the moon together in the middle of the Cold War.
He did. In a 1963 speech to the UN, Kennedy proposed that cooperation in space could help ease the tensions between the two superpowers.
That's a radical idea for that time, especially given how much emphasis was being placed on winning the space race.
It was. And while Khrushchev initially rejected the idea, some historians believe he may have been reconsidering it in the months leading up to Kennedy's assassination.
It's crazy to think how different things might have been.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine. Would a joint mission have accelerated the end of the Cold War? Would it have led to more collaboration in space exploration in the following decades? We'll never know for sure. But it's a really thought-provoking what if.
So even though that joint mission never came to be, was there any cooperation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during this period?
There were moments of cooperation, for sure. especially as the space race began to wind down in the early 1970s. A great example is the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. It was a mission where American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit, a powerful symbol of détente, showing that collaboration in space was possible, even between former rivals.
Must have been an incredible moment, both symbolically and for the future of space exploration.
Absolutely, it paved the way for later collaborations like the International Space Station, a testament to what international cooperation can achieve, even when there are political differences back on Earth.
And speaking of political differences, it's important to acknowledge that the space race wasn't just about technological achievements, it was also very much about ideology.
Right. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union saw their space programs as a way to showcase their systems, to prove they were superior. For the U.S., it was about demonstrating the power of democracy and free enterprise. For the Soviets, it was about proving the efficiency of a centrally planned economy.
So beyond just getting to space first, they were also competing to prove which political and economic model was better.
Exactly. And this ideological battle even played out in the way they approached space exploration. The U.S., with its focus on transparency, openly shared its successes and failures with the world. The Soviets, on the other hand, operated in secrecy. Their cosmonauts were often anonymous until after their missions, and their failures were often downplayed or hidden entirely.
It's interesting how those two contrasting approaches mirrored the broader ideological divide between the superpowers.
It really shows how even something as seemingly objective as science and technology can be shaped by the political and cultural context of the time.
This whole conversation has got me thinking, if the space race were happening today, in the 21st century, what do you think the ultimate prize would be? Would it still be the moon or Mars?
It's a great question. And I think the answer is probably a lot more complex than just a single destination. Today's landscape of space exploration is so diverse, driven by a much wider range of motivations.
Well, we've got private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin now, with ambitions for space tourism, asteroid mining, even colonizing Mars. It's hard to keep up.
It's a very exciting time to be following space exploration. And I think these new players bring a whole new set of complexities and challenges. How do we balance national interests with the role of private companies in space? How do we ensure ethical considerations are at the forefront as we venture further out? These are questions that didn't even exist during the Cold War.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider. But I think it's crucial to remember that even with all these new players and ambitions, the fundamental human drive to explore, that remains unchanged.
Absolutely. That curiosity about the universe, that desire to push the boundaries of what we know, that's what's always driven us to look up at the stars and wonder.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Sputnik, the moon landing, secret Soviet programs, Kennedy's call for cooperation. But there's one aspect of the space race I think we need to address.
I think I know what you're getting at. The human cost.
Exactly. We can't talk about the space race without acknowledging the risks these early pioneers took, the tragedies that occurred along the way. It's easy to get caught up in the technological achievements and forget that real people put their lives on the line to make these missions happen.
You're right. Your sources specifically mentioned Vladimir Komarov, the cosmonaut who tragically died aboard Soyuz 1 in 1967. His story and the Apollo 1 fire. They serve as stark reminders of the dangers involved in pushing the boundaries of space exploration.
It's a sobering thought, but it also speaks to the incredible courage and dedication of these individuals, who are willing to risk everything for the sake of scientific progress and exploration.
It's a testament to the human spirit, isn't it? That drive to push beyond our limits, to explore the unknown, even in the face of danger. That's what makes the space race such a compelling and enduring story. And it continues to inspire us today.
You know, it's incredible when you think about it. Those tragedies, they happened over 50 years ago, and yet here we are, still wrestling with those same questions about risk and reward in space exploration.
Yeah, it's a constant tension, isn't it? How far can we push human limits? What level of risk is acceptable when we're pursuing knowledge and progress? It's a question that comes up time and time again.
And now as we move into this new era, with private companies playing such a big role, I think those questions become even more complex.
For sure, because now it's not just highly trained astronauts who are taking the risks.
Yeah.
You have the potential for space tourists, even families, going beyond Earth's atmosphere. It creates a whole different set of ethical and logistical challenges.
You know, I was reading about the Outer Space Treaty, signed back in 1967. It's been signed by over 100 countries, including, of course, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and it lays out some ground rules for how we explore and use space.
It's a really fascinating document, way ahead of its time in a lot of ways. I mean, it prohibits weapons of mass destruction in space, promotes international cooperation, emphasizes peaceful use of space for the benefit of all humankind.
It's kind of amazing that in the middle of the Cold War, these two rivals could come together and agree on something so significant.
It shows how the urge to explore and understand the universe, well, it can sometimes transcend political differences. A valuable lesson for us today, I think, as we face new challenges and opportunities in space.
It's like the space race. Even though it came from rivalry and competition, it ended up laying the groundwork for a more cooperative approach to space.
I think that's a great point. The Apollo-Soyuz test project was a really symbolic step in that direction, and the International Space Station, continuously inhabited for over 2 decades. It really shows what we can achieve when nations put their differences aside and work together towards a shared goal.
It makes you wonder what von Braun and Korolev would think about all this, those brilliant minds behind the US and Soviet space programs.
Hard to say for sure, but I'd like to believe they would be thrilled to see how far we've come, excited about the future possibilities. I mean, they were both visionaries, driven by that deep belief in human ingenuity.
I bet they wouldn't be surprised at all by SpaceX landing reusable rockets. Or talk of sending people to Mars. Maybe they'd even be a little bit jealous.
Maybe, who knows? But I think they would also urge us to remember the lessons they learned. The importance of balancing ambition with planning, prioritizing safety, international cooperation, understanding that space exploration is ultimately a human endeavor, driven by our curiosity and desire to understand our place in the universe.
Well said. A perfect place to wrap up, I think. What an incredible journey it's been, exploring the space race with you. We covered so much. From those early anxieties with Sputnik, to the triumphs and tragedies of the moon race, and now these new possibilities and challenges in this new era of space exploration.
It's been a pleasure. I hope our deep dive today gave you some fresh perspectives on this fascinating period of history, and that you're inspired to keep looking up at those stars, wondering about the adventures that are still out there.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder that even with global tensions and technological hurdles, the human spirit of exploration always finds a way. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep looking up.
Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.